You think that insignia means something, petty officer? On this base, it means you answer to me. And right now, your uniform is a disgrace. The words, sharp and contemptuous, sliced through the humid air of the naval station's parade ground. Lieutenant Commander Wallace, a man whose crisp uniform seemed a size too small for his ego, stood with his hands on his hips, his voice projecting for the benefit of the assembled junior sailors. The crowd laughed, a nervous, sycophantic ripple of sound that sought the favor of the man in charge. They looked at the target of his scorn, a woman of medium height, her frame lean and wiry, standing with a stillness that was both unnerving and utterly unremarkable. Petty Officer Anya Petrova offered no reaction. Her face, framed by dark hair pulled back into a severe, regulation bun, remained a placid mask. Her eyes, a shade of gray that seemed to absorb the light, were fixed on a point somewhere beyond Wallace's shoulder, as if he were merely a temporary obstruction in her line of sight. But when the base commander, Captain Reynolds, observing from his office window, saw her stance, the subtle, perfect alignment of her feet, the relaxed yet ready posture of her hands, he felt a flicker of recognition, a ghost of a memory from a world far from this sun-bleached concrete. Wallace, blind to these subtleties, saw only what he wanted to see. A new transfer, a woman in a salt-stained, faded Navy working uniform whose quiet demeanor he mistook for weakness. He saw her as an opportunity, a nail to be hammered down to prove his own authority. That blouse is faded, your cover is frayed. It's an insult to everyone here who takes pride in their appearance. He gestured dismissively. You're on my base now. You will learn my standards. Take it off. Hand it to me. The command hung in the thick air, a challenge and a humiliation in one breath. The snickering from the crowd died, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. They were about to witness a dressing down, a public spectacle of authority. They leaned in, hungry for the drama. Petrova's silence stretched, becoming heavier, more profound than Wallace's tirade. It was not the silence of fear or submission. It was the silence of a deep, still ocean, unbothered by the frantic splashing on its surface. If you believe true strength is proven, not proclaimed, type proven below. She blinked once, a slow, deliberate motion. Then her hands moved with an economy that was almost hypnotic. Her fingers, covered in a web of faint, silvery scars and calloused at the tips, went to the buttons of her blouse. There was no hesitation, no fumbling. Each movement was precise, practiced, a piece of muscle memory honed over thousands of repetitions in places Wallace couldn't imagine. The whispers started among the onlookers. Who was she? Where did she come from? Her transfer orders had been vague, routing her through this logistics command for a temporary administrative hold. She was a ghost on the base roster, a name without a story. Wallace saw her compliance as victory. He puffed out his chest, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He had made his point. He had established his dominance. What he failed to understand was that he was not witnessing an act of submission. He was witnessing an act of profound, almost terrifying patience. Petrova continued the methodical process of removing her uniform blouse. The onlookers watched, transfixed, as she unfastened the last button and slipped the worn fabric from her shoulders, revealing the simple navy blue t-shirt beneath. The blouse, faded by sun and sea, held the ghost of her form. She didn't discard it. Instead, she laid it out across her arms and began to fold it. She executed a perfect military fold, her hands moving with the crisp precision of a funeral detail preparing a flag. Each crease was sharp, each edge aligned. It was an act of reverence, a quiet tribute to the uniform he had just declared a disgrace. The very act was a silent, powerful rebuke. She was not discarding a piece of clothing. She was securing a part of her history. When she was finished, the blouse was a tight, perfect rectangle of faded blue camouflage. She held it out to Wallace, her expression unchanging, her gaze still distant. He snatched it from her hands, the rough gesture a stark contrast to her careful preparation. You are confined to your barracks until you can find a uniform that meets my standards, he sneered, tossing the folded blouse onto the ground beside him as if it were a dirty rag. Dismissed, the word was a final, arrogant punctuation mark on his performance. The assembled sailors shuffled their feet, their brief moment of entertainment over, leaving a residue of discomfort in its wake. They avoided looking at Petrova as she turned to leave. To look at her was to acknowledge the shared complicity in her humiliation. She walked away, her back ramrod straight, her pace measured and even. She cut a solitary figure in her plain t-shirt and trousers, moving across the vast expanse of the parade ground. Her steps were silent, leaving no echo. She did not look back. Back in the sterile quiet of her temporary barracks room, she sat on the edge of the tightly made bunk. The room was impersonal, a transient space for a transient soul. There were no photographs, no books, no personal effects, save for a single, heavy-duty Pelican case locked securely at the foot of her bed. She did not pace. She did not sigh. She did not show any sign of anger or distress. She simply sat, her hands resting on her knees, her breathing slow and regular. She was a study in absolute composure. Outside her window, the daily life of the base continued its rhythmic, predictable course. But inside that room, a different kind of energy was gathering. It was the calm of the hurricanes, a place of profound stillness surrounded by immense, coiled power. Wallace, in his office, had already forgotten her, moving on to the next petty tyranny on his agenda. He had asserted his authority, and in his mind, the matter was closed. He had no idea that he had not just disciplined a sailor. He had stripped the camouflage from a predator, and in doing so, had set in motion a chain of events that would shatter his world. The silence in Petrova's room was not empty. It was waiting. The first sign that the day was about to rupture was the alarm. It was not the familiar, rhythmic whoop of a scheduled drill, but a frantic, discordant shriek that signaled a genuine crisis. It echoed across the base, a sound that made stomachs clench and adrenaline spike. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, the air crackled with a panic that was rapidly overwhelming procedure. Lieutenant Commander Wallace stood before a bank of screens, his face pale, his voice strained as he barked orders into a headset. A high-level readiness inspection had gone catastrophically wrong. The inspection scenario involved a simulated active shooter and hostage situation, with the assailant roles played by a visiting team from a highly specialized and deliberately unnamed Naval Special Warfare Unit. They were supposed to test the base's response protocols. Instead, they were dismantling them. The role players had gone off-script. They moved with a speed and ruthless efficiency that the base security force, trained for traffic violations and gate duty, was utterly unprepared for. They had bypassed security checkpoints, jammed communications, and seized the primary command and control building, taking the base's executive officer and his staff as notional hostages. On the screens in the TOC, red icons representing disabled security units blinked in a growing, damning pattern. Radio channels were a cacophony of panicked, overlapping transmissions. "They're not responding to standard protocols," a young ensign shouted, his voice cracking. "They've locked us out of the internal camera feeds." Wallace gripped his console, his knuckles white. His authority, so absolute on the parade ground, was evaporating in the crucible of real pressure. His commands were textbook, predictable, and utterly ineffective. He was throwing sponges at a wildfire. "Establish a perimeter. I want sniper overwatch on all approaches," he yelled, his voice a desperate attempt to project control he no longer felt. A communications technician shook his head. "Negative, sir. Our marksmen can't get a line of sight. The hostiles have sealed the observation points. They anticipated our every move." The atmosphere in the TOC grew thick with the metallic taste of failure. The inspectors, monitoring the exercise from a remote location, were witnessing a complete systemic collapse. Wallace's career was flashing before his eyes. He was being exposed, in real time, as a man whose competence was only as deep as his pristine uniform. He was a gatekeeper, not a warrior, and the wolves were now inside the gates. He had built his world on the rigid enforcement of superficial rules, And that world was now crumbling because he was facing an enemy who didn't play by them. The foundation of his authority was appearance, and in the face of lethal competence, appearance meant nothing. The silence of absolute failure was beginning to descend upon the room, a silence far more damning than the one he had imposed on Petrova hours earlier. The heavy doors to the Tactical Operations Center flew open with a force that made everyone flinch. Standing in the doorway was a figure that did not belong, a specter from a different reality. It was Petrova, but she was not the unassuming petty officer from the parade ground. She was transformed. Gone was the simple t-shirt and trousers. In their place was the full battle rattle of a Tier 1 operator. A Cry precision combat suit in multicam black, a low-profile plate carrier bristling with magazines and specialized equipment, and a heavily modified 18 Malawian Quachas rifle held in a low-ready position with disciplined ease. Her face was partially obscured by a high-cut helmet, its rails holding an array of tactical devices. Her eyes, cold and focused, scanned the room, assessing the chaos in a single, sweeping glance. The equipment was not new. It was scuffed, worn, and stained with the grit of places whose names were classified. It was the working uniform of a ghost, a tool of the trade for someone who operated in the darkest corners of the world. A deafening silence fell over the TOC. The frantic chatter, the panicked shouts, all of it ceased, sucked into the vacuum created by her presence. Lieutenant Commander Wallace stared, his mouth hanging open, his face a mask of disbelief and confusion. "Who the hell are you?" he managed to stammer, his voice a pathetic squeak. Petrova ignored him completely. Her focus was absolute, her movements economical and precise. She strode past the stunned commander as if he were a piece of furniture, her destination the main communications console. "Give me comms," she said. It was not a request. It was a command delivered in a low, flat tone that carried more authority than all of Wallace's shouting. Channel 7. Now, before the technician could even process the order, she was already acting, detaching her personal encrypted radio from her vest and patching it directly into the main console with a practiced flick of her wrist. The room watched, mesmerized, as she keyed the microphone. Her voice, when it came over the speakers, was completely different. The quiet, unassuming woman was gone, replaced by a calm, lethal professional. "Warlock, this is Baba Yaga. Game time is over. Acknowledge." A burst of static, then a new voice, crisp and professional, filled the room, utterly different from the panic chatter of the base security. "Baba Yaga, we copy. Authentication code Alpha 9 Tango." Petrova responded without hesitation. "Code is verified. Stand down your assault." "Repeat, stand down." Mission scrubbed. There was another brief pause. "Solid copy, Baba Yaga." "We're standing down." Just like that, it was over. In less than 30 seconds, she had done what Wallace and his entire team had failed to do in an hour. She hadn't fought the hostiles. She had spoken to them in their native tongue, the language of the elite, a language of quiet, undeniable authority. She had not raised her voice. She had not issued threats. She had simply announced her presence, and that was enough. Just as the last transmission faded into static, the doors to the TOC opened again, this time with less drama. Captain Reynolds, the base commander, walked in. He moved with the steady, unhurried gait of a man accustomed to command, his eyes taking in the entire scene in a quick, practiced assessment. He saw the stunned faces of the watchstanders, the ghost-white pallor of Lieutenant Commander Wallace, and a figure in full battle gear standing calmly by the communications console. Captain Reynolds did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had just seen a long-held suspicion confirmed in the most dramatic fashion possible. His gaze passed over Wallace without a flicker of acknowledgement and settled on Petrova. He walked towards her, his steps deliberate on the tiled floor. The entire room held its breath, waiting for the explosion, for the commander to demand an explanation for this unprecedented breach of protocol. But Reynolds did none of that. His eyes weren't on the rifle or the high-tech gear. They were focused on a small, barely visible patch on Petrova's plate carrier, a subdued, almost invisible symbol that was meaningless to 999% of the military. But to the few who knew, like a carrier group commander who had authorized clandestine missions in the dark waters of the Persian Gulf, it was as distinct as a four-star flag. It was the mark of the tribe, the sigil of the quiet professionals who were sent to solve problems that officially did not exist. Reynolds stopped a respectful distance from her. He didn't speak to her immediately. Instead, he looked at her stance, the same one he'd noticed from his window hours earlier. It was the stance of a shooter, a hunter, someone for whom violence was not an abstract concept, but a clinical skill. He finally understood the ghost of memory she had triggered. She reminded him of the first SEALs he had ever met, decades ago, men who carried the same aura of profound calm, the same sense of coiled lethality beneath a quiet exterior. They were a different breed, operating on a plane of existence far removed from the peacetime bureaucracy of a stateside naval base. He had seen that look in their eyes, and now he saw it in hers. It was the look of someone who had seen the worst of humanity and had not flinched. He had allowed Wallace's petty tyranny to occur on his base, and in doing so, he had allowed one of the nation's most elite warriors to be publicly shamed. The failure was not just Wallace's, it was his own. He knew in that moment that what was about to happen was not just a correction, but an atonement. Captain Reynolds turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over the silent, awestruck personnel in the TOC. His eyes finally landed, like twin hammers of judgment, on Lieutenant Commander Wallace. The captain's voice was low, devoid of heat, yet it carried the chilling weight of absolute authority. "Mr. Wallace," he began, the use of Mr. a deliberate and devastating naval insult, stripping Wallace of his rank and status in a single word. "You stand relieved of duty." Wallace swayed slightly, as if he'd been physically struck. Before he could form a reply, Reynolds turned to his aide. "Pull up the service record for Petty Officer Anya Petrova. Authorize my credentials to bypass all security redactions. Display it on the main screen." Now the aide, his hands trembling slightly, typed furiously at a keyboard. A moment later, a personnel file flickered onto the massive central display. The room collectively inhaled. The file was a constellation of blacked-out lines, but what remained visible was breathtaking. Name: Anya Petrova. Call sign: Baba Yaga. The screen scrolled. Rank: Master Chief Special Warfare Operator. Not a petty officer. A Master Chief, the highest enlisted rank, a living legend in the community. Unit: Naval Special Warfare Development Group. The official, unclassified name for the unit popularly known as SEAL Team 6. The room was utterly silent, the only sound the soft hum of the servers. Then came the awards. The Navy Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor, for actions in a redacted operation. Multiple silver stars, a constellation of bronze stars, each with a small bronze V for valor in combat. Purple Hearts, a list of combat deployments that were nothing but coordinates and dates, stretching back over a decade. At the very bottom of the public file was a single fitness report entry, written by a four-star admiral, the head of Special Operations Command. It read simply, "Master Chief Petrova is not a sailor we deploy. She is a national strategic asset. We aim at a problem." Reynolds let the information sink in, allowing the weight of it to crush the arrogant assumptions that had filled the room only moments before. He then turned back to face the Master Chief. He drew himself up to his full height, his posture shifting from that of a commander to that of a subordinate. He raised his hand in a slow, perfect salute. "Master Chief Petrova." His voice rang with a respect that was profound and absolute. "I apologize for the inexcusable lack of professionalism you have been shown on my base. Your uniform is not a disgrace. It is a testament to a level of service and sacrifice that no one in this room has the right to judge." The story of what happened in the TOC became the stuff of instant legend. It didn't spread through official channels. It moved like electricity through the informal networks that are the true lifeblood of any military installation. It was whispered in mess decks, recounted in hushed, reverent tones in smoky break areas, and typed out on encrypted forums connecting sailors across the globe. They called her the ghost of the TOC, or, more simply, Baba Yaga. The details were embellished with each telling, but the core truth of the story remained a hard, immutable lesson. It was a story about assumptions, about the danger of judging a book by its cover or a warrior by their faded uniform. It was a cautionary tale about the difference between the appearance of authority and the reality of competence. The visiting role-players, elite operators themselves, spoke of it with a kind of professional awe. They talked about the voice that had come over the radio, the calm, unassailable authority that had spoken their language. They hadn't known it was the legendary Baba Yaga, a name they had only ever heard in stories from the front lines, but they had known instantly that they were in the presence of one of their own, a master of their craft. For Lieutenant Commander Wallace, the fallout was swift and absolute. He was formally reprimanded in a letter that was placed permanently in his service record, a career-killing document. He was relieved of his duties and transferred to a desk job in the most remote, forgotten corner of the naval bureaucracy. He was seen one last time packing the contents of his office into a cardboard box. He moved like a ghost, his face pale and drawn, his once arrogant posture now slumped in defeat. He avoided all eye contact, a man publicly broken by his own hubris. He had built his identity on a fragile scaffold of rank and regulation, and when confronted with true, undeniable excellence, it had shattered completely. The story of his downfall became as much a part of the legend as Petrova's vindication. He became a symbol, a walking warning to all those who would mistake the performance of leadership for the practice of it. The institution had purged itself of his particular brand of arrogance, using the quiet competence of one of its finest warriors as the scalpel. Anaphora could be used here to emphasize the lessons learned. It was a lesson that respect is earned in the mud, not issued with a commission. It was a lesson that the quietest person in the room is often the one who is seen the most. It was a lesson that true professionalism requires no audience and seeks no applause. In the aftermath of the incident, as his legend grew, Master Chief Petrova herself remained an enigma. She sought no apologies, participated in no debriefs, and showed no interest in the firestorm her actions had ignited. For her, the crisis in the TOC was not a moment of vindication. It was simply a problem that needed to be solved. She had seen a mission failing, and she had stepped in to correct it. It was what she was trained to do. It was who she was. The day after the incident, Captain Reynolds found her not in the command building, but in the small, anonymous armory attached to the base's training range. She was meticulously cleaning her rifle, breaking it down with the focused, practiced motions of a surgeon. The tools of her trade were laid out on a clean cloth with obsessive precision. Reynolds approached quietly. "Master Chief," he began, his voice filled with a deference that was still new. "On behalf of my command and myself, I want to offer my deepest apologies." Petrova didn't look up from her work. She continued to wipe carbon fouling from the bolt carrier group, her hand steady. After a long moment, she paused, looked him directly in the eye, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Understood, Captain," she said, her voice the same quiet, flat tone as always. That was all. No anger, no resentment, no "I told you so," just a simple professional acknowledgement. Reynolds, feeling the inadequacy of his words, pressed on. "Is there anything you need?" "Anything at all my command can provide for you." He expected a request for new gear, special accommodations, perhaps even assistance with her next set of orders. Petrova paused her cleaning and seemed to consider the offer for a moment. Then she spoke. "My blouse, Captain. The one Mr. Wallace confiscated. I like it back." The request was so simple, so unexpected, that it took Reynolds a moment to process. An aide was dispatched and returned minutes later with a perfectly folded, faded NWU blouse. He handed it to her. She took it, the rough fabric familiar in her hands. She unfolded it and put it on over her T-shirt, the worn material settling over her shoulders like a second skin. To her, this was her real uniform, not the high-tech battle gear, which was just a tool for a specific job, but this simple, salt-stained blouse. It was a map of her journey, a testament written in sweat and thread, a symbol of her identity far more profound than any rank insignia. It was the quiet professional, reclaiming the humble camouflage she preferred to wear. Months bled into years. Captain Reynolds served out his command and retired, his farewell speech containing a pointed story about a quiet sailor who taught a whole base the meaning of competence. Lieutenant Commander Wallace faded into administrative obscurity, a footnote in a much larger story. But the legend of Anya Baba Yaga Petrova endured. It became more than just a piece of gossip. It became institutionalized. New sailors checking into the command were told the story during their orientation, not as a sensational rumor, but as a foundational lesson in the culture of the modern Navy. The story was a mandatory part of leadership training for all new junior officers and chief petty officers. It was presented as the ultimate case study in the dangers of assumption and the virtue of humility. The specific barracks room where she had briefly stayed became an unofficial landmark. Though it was always occupied by a new sailor, the story was attached to it, a ghost that lingered in the sterile space. The instructors at the Base Security Academy incorporated the incident into their curriculum. They developed a new set of protocols for asymmetric threats, based directly on the tactics used by the role players and the de-escalation method employed by Petrova. It was officially designated the Petrova Protocol, a tactical doctrine born from a moment of profound institutional failure and individual brilliance. In the Tactical Operations Center, the gleaming heart of the base's command and control, a small, unofficial plaque was mounted to the wall next to the main communications console. It was simple, discreet, and easily overlooked by the uninitiated. It bore no name, only a date and a single, cryptic call sign, Baba Yaga. It was a quiet, permanent reminder. It served as a warning to the arrogant and an inspiration to the humble. It signified that the true guardians of the institution were not always the ones with the shiniest boots or the sharpest creases in their uniform. They were the quiet professionals, the silent warriors who moved through the ranks, often unnoticed. Their worth measured not in awards or promotions, but in their unwavering ability to act decisively and effectively when everything was on the line. The plaque was a monument not to a person, but to a principle. That character is revealed in crisis, and competence is the only true authority. True strength is not found in the volume of a voice, but in the steady resolve of an action. It does not need to boast, for its results speak with a clarity that no rhetoric can match. It is a quiet force, patient and observant, waiting not for applause, but for the precise moment when its application is most needed. Anya Petrova's legacy on that base was not a statue in a courtyard or a portrait hanging in a hall of heroes. Her legacy was a standard. It was a change in the way people saw each other, a subtle but profound shift in the culture, away from the superficial and toward the substantive. She left behind the enduring principle that competence is the ultimate currency, the only measure of worth that truly matters when chaos descends. She proved, in one brief, explosive afternoon, that respect is not an entitlement of rank, but a debt that is owed to demonstrated, undeniable excellence. Her silence, the quality that the arrogant and the ignorant so foolishly mistook for weakness, was in fact her greatest strength. It was not the silence of emptiness, but the deep, resonant silence of a professional who had walked through the fire and emerged with a profound understanding of her own capabilities. It was the calm of a soul so confident in its purpose that it required no external validation. Her story became a living testament, passed down from one generation of sailors to the next, a reminder that the most formidable person in any room may not be the one at the head of the table, but the one standing quietly in the corner, watching, waiting, and ready. She taught them to look for the steady hands, the calm eyes, the quiet professional who will always have the final, decisive word, often without ever needing to speak it. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.